You're listening to the Platte River Bard.
Hello, and welcome to the Platte River Bard. This is Chris Berger.
And I'm Sherry Berger.
And we are here with Leo Adam Biga. He is an author. He is a journalist. You would probably recognize something that he's written. He was written for the reader for over a 27-year period, writing features and also cover stories. You're bound to come into his work at some point in your life if you've lived in the Omaha area for sure. He is a lifelong Nebraskan, and thank you very much, sir, for joining us and talking with us today.
Yes, thank you.
Yeah, thank you guys. Appreciate the opportunity. You mentioned the reader.
Yes, sir.
And because it had such a following,
it did.
and now I have to phrase it this way: it continues to have such a following because some of your listeners may know, some may not. It has been relaunched. The Reader is alive again. It's been relaunched by Nebraska Public Media.
Nice.
And I still don't think the word has gotten around. I don't see a lot of traffic on their social media, but I've already completed 4 new stories for this new iteration of the Reader, 3 of which have been published, 1 of which is in the queue or the pipeline.
Sure.
And hopefully more to follow. So I didn't expect that the Reader would have a new life again, at least this soon, and I certainly didn't expect that an organization as well resourced as Nebraska Public Media would take on that legacy. Yeah. And so kudos to them, and it's good news, I think, for consumers of content and creators of content. So
yeah. Well, so what got you started and interested in writing?
Yeah, it's a similar story to a lot of writers. There was a particular teacher at my North Omaha parochial school, Holy Name, who encouraged me, prodded me to get involved with the school newspaper and, all that kind of jazz. But he was important to me for 2 reasons, really simultaneously. He also, in addition to teaching journalism, taught this kick-ass, really unlikely film history and appreciation class. Now, this was a poor, urban, parochial school that was already in the process of dying out, and somehow he got it past his superiors to screen the kinds of things that film screens.
Okay. Sure.
But now what I mean when I'm referring to, not just art films, but films with certain content that you would not expect he would have gotten approval.
Yeah.
To impressionable teenagers. Uh-huh. And I don't know if they knew what he was showing, or maybe they didn't, but anyway, it happened. And the reason why this was so influential to me is that I was a budding film buff, but in my own family, I didn't have really anyone to talk to about these movies I was seeing mostly all on television at the time. We're talking about this is the 1970s. Mm-hmm. I basically was not going to the theater to see movies at this point in my life. That was not part of my growing up. But I was seeing a lot of movies on television, and they were having this great impact on me, and I knew they were affecting me. I didn't know how to articulate it, and I didn't have anyone close to me to talk to about it, including friends. So then I'm in this class at Holy Name, and I'm seeing some of the very same films that were impacting me that I'd seen at home. And now his name is Michael Kranick. He's still very much around, and he and his wife, Janet Farber, they have served as kind of the co-art editors for the Reader for the last many years, actually.
Oh, cool.
Whether they're going to be part of the new iteration of the Reader, I don't know. I'm not privy to that information. But Mike Kranick affirmed for me that I wasn't crazy, that movies that were, profoundly impacting me emotionally, psychologically, were indeed things to be taken seriously. And so that set me on a path where ultimately I became, I studied journalism formally at the University of Nebraska at Omaha. I got my bachelor's degree. I ran the campus film program there. I was so crazy about film that I ended up running it even after I graduated for like a decade. So totally as a volunteer. And then eventually my passion for film and my passion for writing merged. And I began writing about film and then other art forms. And so that's why I eventually became known somewhat as an arts culture writer reporter in the Omaha and Nebraska market.
Sure, absolutely.
Wow. So what were some of those movies that were influencing you?
I can still remember almost feeling some of the feelings I felt when I first saw the great 1954 movie On the Waterfront. Omaha's own Marlon Brando. And, at the time, again, I couldn't have told you what I was feeling. I just know that I was overwhelmed by it. And, I just rewatched that movie maybe for the 15th or 20th time very recently. And it kind of still had the same effect on me. 60, probably first saw it when I was, 10, 12, something like that. So it's still over 50 years later, it was still impacting me in this way. So, I just gradually found myself attracted to film beyond just the pure entertainment aspects to, appreciating some of the more aesthetic aspects. And then, the more I learned, the more I discovered that how much I didn't know. And it's like anything that you're passionate about, the more you cultivate that passion, you find out there's still ever more to learn. And there's ever more films to discover. And, just when I think I've seen all the classic movies that are worth seeing. And then, in a year's span, I discovered 10, 15, 20 others that I somehow never came across before. So,
who's your favorite filmmaker, director that's still making films right now?
Well, professionally, I have to be careful. I have a book out on Alexander Payne, right?
Yeah,
So I've been.
I was just going to say that. I was just going to say that.
That's the late '90s. But sometimes, I don't want to leave people with the impression that just anything that he makes, I automatically like just because I cover him. I happen to think, as a lot of people do, that he is one of the best filmmakers of the last half century. Worldwide. And so, he would be right up there for sure. I don't see as many of the contemporary movies as I once did when I used to see, seemingly everything that came out like in the 1980s. I'd see it at the Dundee Theater or well into the 90s. And then my film going habits changed like it has for a lot of people. And I started watching more movies at home. But I could probably name a few other filmmakers, but I do tend to go back still to the past. So, like some of my favorite golden era Hollywood filmmakers, be people like John Huston, Orson Welles, Elia Kazan. He was the director of On the Waterfront, and I could name dozens more. Alfred Hitchcock, of course. The names go on and on and on. And that's the beautiful thing about film. I know that Martin Scorsese often encourages people, you should think of film, like people have a favorite painting or a favorite book. You should treat film the same. Revisit that work of art over and over and over again, because if it's something that stands the test of time, it will keep giving back to you, and you'll keep mining new riches from it, no matter how many times you revisit it, so.
Yeah, I noticed I had been to your website and had read quite a bit about Dick Mueller before we interviewed him last year. And I know that you have written about him even since then. So.
Yes, Dick, he says, Leo, I've become an annuity to you. Because I think there's been at least 4, maybe 5 Dick Mueller pieces I've written that have been published in the last 3 years. And that's the thing. I was so glad that he received that Lifetime Achievement Award from the OEAs recently.
Yes.
I'm sure that 75 to 90% of the people in the audience that night had no idea who Dick Mueller was. They had never heard the name. They never had heard of the Firehouse Dinner Theater. They didn't know that Omaha once had 2,000 seats, a professional theater, that were being filled virtually every week. It's kind of astounding when you think about it, right?
Yeah.
Well, we were really thankful to get some time with him to podcast with him. It's so great that you do that with all of these Omaha legends.
Well, and he's a good example of the kind of thing I like to do when the opportunity arises. So the story about Dick that is dearest to me, the story of Dick that I've written that is dearest to me is the one that I did for American Theater Magazine about his relationship with the great Josh Logan.
Yes.
Or Joshua Logan. That's one of the greatest names in American theater history. And because of the friendship that Dick, developed with Josh ended up coming to Omaha on a number of occasions to direct here, twice at the Firehouse Dinner Theater for separate shows, including at least one of those shows. These were shows that Logan had directed on Broadway, decades earlier. And then he also did a one-man review of his life and career at the Firehouse. And so when I can come across stories that are nuggets like that are not well known, where persons of great importance have intersected with Omaha or Nebraska. So on the film side, the story that I've been waiting to tell for decades, I finally got to tell in both Nebraska History Magazine and Flatwater Free Press. And that's the story of when, before anybody knew who they were, Francis Ford Coppola, George Lucas, Robert Duvall, James Caan, Shirley Knight came to Ogallala, Nebraska for the last several weeks shooting on a movie called The Rain People, written and directed by Coppola. George Lucas was a protege of Coppola's at the time, and he was along for the ride because it very much was a caravan of film artists who traveled from back east, down south, then up to the Midwest, to Nebraska eventually. And they traveled through in a caravan of cars, trucks, vans with their equipment and this and that. And he ended up in Ogallala, and that intersection led to not only the completion of that feature film, The Rain People, which was so they came to Ogallala in 1968. That film, The Rain People, was released in 1969. George Lucas was primarily there to shoot a documentary about the making of The Rain People.
Right.
So that was eventually released, and then Robert Duvall and James Caan, they kind of fell in with these two ranch families in the area, the Petersons and the Haythorns, and that led to Duvall coming back to Nebraska several times in the early 70s to direct a feature-length documentary, which has virtually been unseen for decades, and it's a superb film. I'm lucky enough to have a copy of it, called We're Not the Jet Set. And it's about the Peterson family. They were a traveling ranch rodeo family. And they were the most colorful characters you could imagine, real-life people. And Duvall captured them just unadorned. It's a very politically incorrect film because they were a very politically incorrect bunch. And so that's a story that I had learned about when I was just a young film buff, and I ended up interviewing all the principals involved in that story, with the exception of George Lucas, to get that story documented. And so that was very satisfying to me. So when I can come across stories like that and share them with people, it feels like, I'm going beyond just telling a story, but maybe helping educate and advance the culture a little bit. So.
Yeah, absolutely. We're lucky to have someone local like yourself, and you were able to access these people too. That's always a challenge, I think, is to access the people and network so that you can do that.
Yeah. and then there's a film figure that I'm a big champion of. So this is someone that I interviewed a lot during the last 15 years of her life, 20 years of her life. Joan Micklin Silver, a wonderful filmmaker, Omaha native. Most people here, unfortunately, don't know the name. They may know one or two of her movies. And so she was a feature filmmaker in Hollywood and out of Hollywood, starting in the early to mid 70s, and was very busy through the end of the 90s. And she ended up directing a lot for cable, movies for Showtime, HBO.
Okay.
But in her earlier feature film career, she was making movies for major studios, but also making independent features. And the first of those is a film that's in the National Film Registry. So Alexander Payne doesn't have a film in the National Film Registry.
Mm-hmm.
I think he will someday, and probably have more than one.
Yeah.
But Joan Micklin Silver, the late Joan Micklin Silver's debut feature, Hester Street, which I recommend to any of your listeners. It's easily accessible. It's a beautiful, poignant, funny slice of life, black and white look at life among Jewish emigres on the Lower East Side of New York in the late 19th century, early 20th century. It's a wonderful piece of work, and then she made kind of an echo to that film several years later, and this one's a little better known than Hester Street, called Crossing Delancey, starring Peter Riegert and Amy Irving.
Okay. Yes.
I think it's one of the best romantic comedies of the last 40, 50 years. And so that's also Joan Micklin Silver. And that's about
realize that. Okay.
the lives of latter day Jewish Americans on the Lower East Side whose roots were, their ancestors or their parents or grandparents had come over from the old country. But now Crossing Delancey is about that the generation that has only known America, right? Mm-hmm. And yet they're still steeped a bit in the old world because of the elders in their life and the neighborhoods that they live in.
Yes.
But if you're familiar with the film, it's the friction between the Amy Irving character who wants to leave all that behind and have nothing to do with it, and the Peter Riegert character who's still very much rooted in that past, and how these two opposites, there's no doubt there's a chemistry and attraction, but she keeps resisting because he's a pickle salesman, and she looks down on that, and she's like an aspiring person in the literary world. So
yes, it's an excellent movie.
Wow.
Yeah.
So tell us a little bit about some of the things that you've done outside of Nebraska.
Well, I have had the opportunity to do a little travel for my work. Not much, but enough to, definitely have led to some good stories. And so, in no particular order, I had the opportunity to go to Hollywood, Los Angeles, Santa Barbara to cover Payne and some of his movies. Believe it or not, the Reader, this was in the Reader's heyday, they actually paid my way there.
All right.
And if you know the Reader, that was inconceivable that they would send anybody for anything anywhere.
Yeah.
But I managed to convince the late John Huston to do that a couple times. I embedded myself with a group of continuing ed students for a class offered by Iowa Western Community College about baseball, and it was a Midwest tour, Midwest baseball tour, and so we ended up visiting major league ballparks in Kansas City, St. Louis, Chicago, minor league ballparks in towns and cities in between those stops. We visited baseball shrines and museums. We met former players, including former Negro League players, and anyway, it was a very immersive experience, and I wrote a long piece about that experience for the Reader. Then I embedded myself with a group of Nebraskans who took a bus trip to Obama's first inauguration as president, right?
Mm-hmm.
So that was obviously an historic experience with mainly African-American group of individuals who were unbelievably stoked, as they should have been for that experience. So there was that, and then the big one was accompanying world boxing champion Terence Crawford to Uganda and Rwanda, Africa, and so I nabbed a international journalism grant from my alma mater, UNO, to make that happen, and
Cool.
and he was there with a woman, Jamie Nolette, who had taught him in elementary school in North Omaha, and she left teaching eventually, and she formed this nonprofit, this NGO called Pipeline Worldwide, and they build water wells in villages, and they provide resources and supplies to schools and other kinds of institutions and organizations and villages in those countries. And Terence had gone with her on one trip. I was already covering Terence because of his developing professional boxing career.
Yeah.
And I found out that he had gone. It was like, Terence, like, you never mentioned this, bud. Like, and I hear that you're going again. Like, can I come along? And he said yes. And then that's when I applied for that grant to make that happen. Yeah.
That's awesome that you could do that.
Yes.
And it's awesome that you can make a living and write in Omaha as well, I would think.
It's no mean feat, sir.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, it's like, so it's relative, right? So my living is pretty meager. I mean, for a person my age, I'm pushing 67. With a college education, I should have earned a lot more money than I've earned at this point in my life. It's weird how things happen because I've had my best years the last 4 years, and so it started with the pandemic. Strangely enough, so it's like it doesn't make sense. Like this late in my career, the pandemic happening.
Yeah,
and it was just a confluence of events. The biggest of those being, having some good journalism clients that got me through the roughest patch of the pandemic. One of those, you may or may not be familiar with. It eventually went away, but it is in the process of being relaunched. And I'm referring to NOISE, North Omaha Information Support, everyone.
Okay.
So North Omaha, African American centric focus. And so anyway, that helped me get through that rough patch, the work that I did for NOISE. And then eventually Flatwater came around, and that helped. But the biggest difference for me, I had 2 concurrent book projects. And so the kind of book projects that I do are nonfiction, and they're I'm basically ghostwriting people's autobiographies in many cases. And so to have 2 book projects at the same time, I can't tell you the difference that makes, because these are projects that I set up with the subject who is the client. And so it's set up so I get paid every month, and that's over 16 to 18 months. So it made a huge difference. I was actually able to pay my bills, and for the first time in a long time, actually save some money and do some things.
That's great.
Cool.
Yeah.
Congratulations. I hope it continues.
Believe me, I do as well. So there are some prospective book projects, that may come to fruition later this year. And so if I get one of those, sweet. If I get 2 of those, I'll have to count my blessings, double it. Yeah.
Nice.
So you'll have book tours scheduled then? All around the country, or?
No, these are not those kind of books.
Not those kind?
No. No, so the thing is, if I'm doing a book, if I'm ghostwriting a book for somebody, it's their book.
Yeah, right.
Yes.
In other words, right. So I give them a manuscript, they get it published.
Yeah.
My name appears sometimes on the cover, but more often, inside the book, there's some kind of recognition that I helped with this process.
Right.
But I'm paid, so my job is done.
Da-da-da, yes.
Yeah, and so I don't have to get myself involved with the mess and the challenge of trying to market a book that at the end of the day would have very little chance of selling many copies just because the competition is so ridiculous.
Yes.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And so, it's up to the client how much they want to invest further in terms of marketing the book.
Yes,
Right.
indeed.
So, and that can be and then there's the time factor. Like, the two most recent of these, the subject of one is a full-time practicing physician in Norfolk, Nebraska. So how much time can he really devote to making appearances for his book? Not much. I wish he could do more, but it's just not the reality that he's living in. And the other book is about this young entrepreneur, and he's the CEO of a multi-dimensional company which has sub-companies, and so he only has so much time to devote to marketing. So it's up to them, but I give them the manuscript. They do what they do with it. It gets out into the world to the extent that it does.
You have to interview them first, or they are recording things about their life and send it to you?
It for me, the way I work is 99% interview based, and I get what I need beyond that, just through some Google searches and whatnot. But we're not pretending that we're writing, great literature or even great prose, but we're hopefully being authentic to each of these individuals, stories, and trying to be as factual as we can be and as accurate as we can be. And what I do with those projects, where I am essentially, I'm trying to write in their voice as much as possible.
Yeah.
And so that's an interesting process.
That's good.
Yeah, I suppose that would be the biggest challenge,
that's
is to try to write it sort of in their voice and their style.
Mm-hmm.
If there is such a thing, yeah.
Right.
And as you know, everyone communicates differently.
For sure.
Everyone uses language differently. And so I just try to steep myself as much as possible by, I obviously record the interviews I do with them, and I transcribe the interviews. Of course, I'm listening to them over and over and over. And then I just kind of try to channel as best I can. Now, at the end of the day, probably half the words are my own, half the words are their own.
Sure.
And that's just like making sure that I try to divorce myself from the voice I'm used to using all the time, and to make it more, fit more with their own voice. And I'm sure at the end of the day, it's kind of a bit of a hodgepodge, a bit of a hybrid, but so far no one has complained. No one has said, this doesn't sound like me. So,
cool.
Yeah.
That's great.
So far, so good.
Well, Omaha is definitely, Nebraska is definitely lucky to have you, and you have just cataloged so many historic things that I fear would have been lost otherwise. So
yeah,
it's wonderful that you're doing that. And how exciting about the interview with the work with Alexander Payne. That's very exciting.
Yes.
Yeah, well, I haven't interviewed him since the Holdovers, and we're going to be doing the first interview since that project in a couple weeks. And I have so much to ask him about. Recently he received a Lifetime Achievement Award at the Sarajevo Film Festival.
Okay.
And I don't think it's the first Lifetime Achievement Award that he's been recognized with. It's weird because he's never received that recognition in Nebraska. Yeah. There's never been an Alexander Payne Film Festival in Nebraska.
There needs to be.
Well, it's kind of crazy that there hasn't been.
Yeah.
But anyway, I'll leave that to the people that do those things.
Mm-hmm.
Believe me, if I was still in film programming, this would have happened a long time ago. But he's been very gracious with his time over the years, and I think my first interview with him was in 1997, I believe. So we're going on 28, 29 years journey with him now, and I started covering him when he was setting up the film Election.
Okay.
I remember
I didn't go back to his very first film with him on Citizen Ruth.
Yeah.
And just an interesting aside, When I was a film programmer, it was the last year that I did that, 1990, 1991. The organization I was active with at that time was called the New Cinema Co-op, or New Cinema Cooperative. We had a storefront theater, you call it a micro theater today, in North Downtown. And
Cool.
Basically, I had read a little item in the Omaha World Herald about this young man who had a student thesis film, Passion of Martin, that was showing at film festivals around the nation, maybe even around the world. And that obviously piqued my interest. I let my colleagues at the New Cinema Co-op know about this, and I said, don't you think we should try to screen this movie? And they agreed. And so we didn't meet him, but we acquired the film for screening, and we were all very impressed by it. And then it was, 6-7 years after that I first met him. And how that came about is I had seen Citizen Ruth. I was blown away by it. And I knew that Election was something that he had announced as a next project. And in the meantime, someone wrote a cover story on him for the reader. And I could tell that it was written by someone who was not like a film buff and wasn't so well steeped in that world. And so I just thought, this guy deserves a much better story than this. And so that's what actually motivated me to reach out to Payne for the first time and request an interview. And we hit it off. We met at McFoster's Natural Kind Cafe, as you may remember, that vegetarian restaurant. It's been gone for a while now. Again, this was in the 90s. And so, we hit it off, and many interviews have followed. So
that's wonderful. You are definitely an asset to the community, and
yes,
especially even your love of film and theater really shows through your work. And you've been on my list for a while to talk to, so I was really glad that our paths crossed and we could have you on the podcast.
Well, very sweet of you to say those things, and part of this is when one just been doing the same thing for as long as I have, naturally you build up a body of work, and so it's just kind of the natural course of things. And I didn't think I would be as busy as I am at this age, but while the things are rolling, I'm going to keep rolling with it as long as I can.
Heck yeah.
Go with the flow. That's wonderful. I'm so glad that things are. And please keep us in mind. You're welcome to come on the podcast anytime.
Yes.
And talk about any of your new works or anything. It would be great just to be able to talk to you about those things.
Appreciate it.
Wonderful. Well, until next time then.
Yes, thank you.
Thank you so much for talking to us.
Yes.
Thank you, Sherry. Thank you, Chris. Much appreciated.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you for listening and supporting the arts in the Platte River area and beyond. Please subscribe to our podcast so you are sure to catch all of our future episodes and join us on social media. See you next time on the Platte River Bard.